During Easter dinner, my son pushed a guardianship paper across the table, announcing I could no longer manage my own life. His father-in-law smirked. "You'll be in a nursing home soon, old man." Meaning that their entire family looked at me like I was a man already finished. I said nothing. When the waiter came to settle the bill, I simply handed him a black card. He saw the name went pale and rushed for the manager. As the manager approached our table, head bowed and hands trembling, the table went completely silent. "Welcome and thank you for being here. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from." This story contains fictional elements and dramatized details added to deepen the experience. Any resemblance to real names or events is coincidental. Like and subscribe so you never miss the next one. I know wood the way some men know weather by feel before it tells you anything. The grain under my palm on a Tuesday evening in early April speaks in a language I have been learning for 50 years, and I am still not done learning it. This piece is oak. White oak may be 12 years, dried, pulled from a board I have been saving, since before I had a clear reason to save it. My right hand moves along the surface the way it always does, slowly with the heel of the palm, reading the rise and fall of the grain, the way a man reads a road he has driven 1,000 times, but still watches. There is a rocking chair on the workbench behind me with a cracked spindle. I will get back to it. Tonight the oak wants attention first. My name is Walter Briggs, 72 years old, furniture craftsman, and for the last 45 years, the man who kept this shop on Meeting Street alive with nothing more than good wood, honest work, and the memory of the woman who believed in both of us before I fully believed in myself. The shop is 1,400 square feet on Meeting Street in Charleston, South Carolina. The east-facing window is to my left. She insisted on that. Window said the morning light was the only honest light for reading a finish, that anything else flattered the wood when it shouldn't. She was right, as she was right, about most things that involve paying careful attention. I should tell you what I actually am before I tell you what is coming. I am not a complicated man. I wake at 5:30. I am in this shop by 6:15. I work until my hands tell me to stop. I fix things that are broken, and I make things that will last. I charge a fair price, and I do not negotiate down from it, because the work is worth what I say it is worth, and the people who understand that are the people I want in this shop. I have been doing this since I was 27 years old. I expect to be doing it at 80 if my hands hold. The tools on the wall are in her order. She arranged them in 1987, and I have not moved them since. Not from grief, or not only from grief. From the understanding that her order was better than any order I would have invented. She put the chisels by size left to right, and the planes grouped by function, and the measuring tools at eye level, because she said, "A measuring tool you have to reach for is a measuring tool you use, less than you should." Every time I reach for something and find it exactly where she put it, I think, yes, that is correct. There is a crack in the third workbench leg from a dropped hammer, and I have never repaired it because she laughed when it happened, and the crack has been her laugh in the room ever since. She has been gone for 8 years. The tools are still in her order. I was sanding the edge of the oak panel when the phone rang at 6:15. It was my son, Everett. He is 40 years old, a senior financial analyst, and he calls me on Thursday evenings without fail, or he did until about 2 months ago when the Thursdays started going quiet. Tonight was a Tuesday, which was the first thing I noticed. "Dad," he said. "Easter Sunday, the Palmetto Room. Claire's family is hosting. Noon. You will come, won't you?" I said yes. I said, "Of course." I asked if I should bring anything. "No," he said, "just come." It was a short call. Shorter than our Thursday calls, which had themselves been getting shorter. He was polite in the way that people are polite when they are managing something they do not want you to see until they are ready for you to see it. I have known my son for 40 years, and I know the difference between his comfortable voice and his careful voice. Tonight was the careful voice, the managing voice. The voice he uses when he has decided something and is presenting it as an invitation. Do you know what it sounds like when someone who loves you is managing you? It sounds almost exactly like love. The phrasing is right. The warmth is present. The invitation is genuine on its surface. What is different is the weight behind it, the sense that the words have been chosen rather than simply said. Everett's words tonight were chosen. I could hear the choosing. I set the phone down and went back to the oak. My hands found the surface again, and I kept moving, because the work does not stop being true just because something else has become uncertain. I tested the rocking chair spindle one more time, pressing my thumb against the repaired joint to check the set of the glue. It held. I ran my hand along the rocker arm, checking for anything my eye might have missed. The light in the shop was the color of old honey by 7:30. The workbench lamp casting its yellow circle over the work while everything else went dark. I turned it off and stood in the dark for a moment before locking up. I told myself it was just a family dinner. I almost believed it. There is a particular kind of morning that feels like a door you have been standing in front of for a long time, and today is that morning, Easter Sunday. I am standing at the bathroom mirror on Rutledge Avenue, holding the collar button of my one good dress shirt between my fingers, not yet fastening it. The shirt has a wrinkle at the second button that I pressed out last night, and that has come back anyway, the way certain things do. On the floor beside the sink are the shoes from Everett's wedding, dark brown leather, bought for that occasion, and worn 5 times since the heels barely marked. I put them on last, and I noticed them first. 5 years ago, my son married Claire Harllo in a ceremony at the Harllo estate on the south Broad end of this city, and I became a Sunday dinner guest in a house that had decided what it thought of me before I walked through the gate. I have been a Sunday dinner guest in that house approximately 40 times since. This is what I know from those 40 visits. Harlan Harllo, 64 years old, founder and managing partner of Harllo Financial, the kind of man who has been told he is exceptional for so long that he can no longer process evidence to the contrary, enters my memory at every Sunday dinner through the same gesture, asking a question and turning away before the answer arrives. The first time I met him, he asked me what I did, and I said I restored and built custom furniture, and he said, "So, refinishing sanding things down," and then turned to speak to someone across the room before I had finished the sentence. I have thought about that turn many times. It was not accidental. It was the most honest thing he ever did in front of me. 5 years of Sunday dinners. That is roughly 260 meals where I was the wrong ingredient in someone else's recipe. Nadine Harllo, 61. Harlan's wife sat at every dinner with the composed expression of a woman who had spent 4 decades perfecting the art of making other people feel welcomed and insufficient at the same time. Her compliments always contained the word just. Just a small shop, is it? Just the 2 of you running it. She said, "We just want Everett to have every opportunity. You understand, it's not about anything else," and I understood that it was entirely about something else. Only she had arranged the words so that disagreeing with her felt like bad manners. Preston Harllo, 31. Harlan's son referred to my work as the repair thing, with the casual contempt of a man who has never needed to earn anything, and therefore cannot imagine why anyone would. I noted the phrase. I noted it every time. Claire Harllo Briggs, 34 years old. My daughter-in-law, Everett's wife, greeted me at every family dinner with warmth that was technically correct in every detail. The right words, the right smile, the right amount of time spent asking about my week. And yet, it always felt to me like a room that had been staged rather than lived in. I do not think this is her fault. She was raised in a house where impressions were managed, and I do not know how you unlearn that. When does a man stop being a person in a room and start being a problem someone hasn't solved yet? I have been asking myself that question for approximately 4 years, which is how long it took me to understand that the Sunday dinners were not occasions but negotiations, and that I was the only one at the table who hadn't been briefed. That's my son Everett Briggs, 40 years old, a man I watched learn to sand wood and ask questions and grow into someone I trusted completely, had been changing for 5 years in the particular way that things change when no single moment is ever quite bad enough to name. I noticed it the way I notice a drawer that is starting to stick, not broken, not urgent, just slightly incrementally wrong in a direction that only becomes clear when you finally pull hard and find it won't open. I noticed it in the conversations that started taking the shape of conversations he had already finished before he called me. I noticed it in the specific topics he stopped raising, I noticed it in the way he started answering my questions about his work with phrases that sounded like talking points rather than thoughts. I did not say anything. I kept watching. 8 months ago, he came to the shop on a weekday afternoon, which was unusual in itself. He stood in the doorway, not inside, not outside, just at the threshold, with his hands in his pockets and his weight shifted back, the way a person stands when they are not planning to stay. I waited. He said, "Dad, maybe it's time to think about what comes next." Then he said, "I have to get back." Then his truck pulled out of the gravel lot, and I stood in the doorway and watched it go. He stood in the doorway and would not come inside. His father's shop, the place he learned to hold a tool. He would not come inside. I buttoned the collar. I picked up the shoes from Everett's wedding and put them on my feet and laced them and stood up. I picked up my keys from the nightstand. I thought about that doorway. Something is wrong. I just don't know the shape of it yet. The fourth Thursday in a row, and my phone buzzed before I even set down the sandpaper. I am going to step back from Easter morning for a moment, because Easter morning did not arrive without a history. 3 weeks before it, on a Wednesday, I was in the shop on Meeting Street, sanding a mahogany side table, warm, grain-tight figure, the kind of wood that rewards patience and punishes shortcuts, when the phone vibrated on the corner of the bench where I always set it while I work. I picked it up and read the message and set it face down and kept sanding. That was the fourth Thursday in a row that Everett had canceled our call. The text said, "Can't do Thursday this week. We'll explain soon." 4 weeks. He kept saying soon. I should tell you what the Thursday calls were before I tell you what their absence meant. Every Thursday evening at 6:30, for the better part of 4 years, my son called me, and we talked for between 20 minutes and an hour about nothing urgent the week's work. Something he had read a problem with, a piece I was building, occasionally something about his job that he was allowed to discuss. It was not a formal arrangement. It had simply become the rhythm, the way certain things become the rhythm when two people have decided, without saying, so that they want to keep the distance between them from growing. 4 Thursdays gone. No call, no explanation, beyond soon, and soon arriving the following Tuesday in the form of a new cancellation. When does a man stop calling it busy and start calling it avoidance? The mahogany dust was fine and sweet in the air that morning. I kept working because the work is what steadies me when thinking leads nowhere useful. The table was a commission from a woman on Lagar Street. She had inherited it from an aunt and wanted the surface restored without losing the patina, which is the kind of instruction that requires you to know the difference between old and damaged, between worn and broken. I understood the assignment. I ran my thumb along the edge and felt where the finish had lifted at the corner and calculated the approach. I thought about Claire's voicemails, 3 of them across the same 4-week span, each one slightly more formal than the last, each one landing in my inbox at a time of day when she would have known I was in the shop and unlikely to answer. "Walter, it's Claire. Please call Everett back when you get a chance. Thank you." The thank you at the end was the part that stayed with me. We had never been a family that said thank you to close a sentence. That is a phrase from a different kind of conversation, the kind where you were not quite sure of your welcome. The 4th Thursday. No call, no reason, just soon. I set the sander down and sat on my stool for a long time. The shop was quiet the way it is on a Wednesday morning before the street traffic picks up. Sawdust smell and linseed and the faint copper edge of the old finish I had been stripping from the table's surface. Outside, a truck went by on Meeting Street slowing for the light. A few days before this, Everett had left his phone on my kitchen counter while he was in the other room. We had had dinner together, just the 2 of us, and he had set his phone down, the way you set something down when you are comfortable in a place. I was carrying dishes to the sink when the screen lit. I did not intend to read it. The screen was face up, and the notification was there before I could turn away. "Don't lose your nerve. This is the right thing for everyone." I did not know the name on that screen. But I knew the tone of someone accustomed to giving instructions to people who need steadying. I set the dishes in the sink and said nothing, and we finished the evening the way we always finished it. Everett took his phone and left, and I stood at the kitchen window for a while after his taillights cleared the end of the block. I did not ask him about it. I am still not certain whether that was wisdom or cowardice. Back at the bench that Wednesday morning, I returned to the mahogany because it was the only thing in the room that would not lie to me. The table did not know anything was wrong. That was a comfort in the way that the indifference of good materials is sometimes a comfort. I worked the surface slowly, with the grain reading the response under my palm. The table received the attention without complaint. I counted the grain lines in the board nearest my hand. There were 11 in the space of 2 inches, which is tight, good stock, grown slowly worth the patience. The finish lifted cleanly at the corner when I pressed. The wood underneath was sound. Whatever had been damaged was only on the surface, and surfaces can always be brought back, given the right tools and enough unhurried time. I cleaned the bench. I covered the mahogany with its cloth. I locked the shop door and stood on the gravel for a moment before getting into the truck. The evening air smelled of the neighbors' wisteria early for it, but the April warmth had pushed everything forward this year. I did not know yet exactly what was coming, but I had stopped pretending I did not need to find out. There is a kind of driving you do when thinking has stopped being useful. I have known that road to Lyall's house for 50 years, and my hands found it before I decided to go. I did not make a formal decision to drive to North Charleston that Wednesday morning. I locked the shop, got into the truck, and drove north without rehearsing why. Some errands do not require deciding. They simply begin the destination already settled before the engine turns over. The coffee from that morning was still sitting on the workbench untouched. I had not eaten. Neither of those facts seemed important. Lyall Cotton, 74 years old, Ruth's older brother, a retired private investigator of 30 years, and the one person in my life who has never once told me everything was going to be fine, lives in a 1-story house in North Charleston that he has owned since 1978. The house has a screen porch and a yard that is kept but not tended, and a driveway made of packed gravel that I have pulled into so many times I can identify the sound of my own tires on it from inside the cab. I had barely cut the engine when the front door opened. Lyall has always been the kind of man who opens the door before you knock, not because he is watching for you, but because trouble has a particular weight on a porch, and he has learned to feel it through the floor. He stood in the doorway in his flannel shirt and looked at my face and said, "Kitchen's warm, coffee's on." The way you say that to a person you have been half expecting and are not entirely surprised to see. He did not ask what was wrong. That was the first thing that frightened me. I followed him into the kitchen. The room smelled of coffee and something faintly medicinal, the eucalyptus drop he kept on the counter for his shoulder. The table was clear, 2 mugs already out. I sat in the chair I always sit in and wrapped my hands around the mug he pushed toward me and looked at the grain of his kitchen table for a moment before I started talking. I told him everything, the 4 Thursdays. Claire's voicemails with their formal thank yous closing each sentence. The dinner with Everett a few days back, the phone left on the counter, the notification on the screen before I could look away. I said the message aloud, "Don't lose your nerve. This is the right thing for everyone." I told him I had not recognized the name and that I had not asked Everett about it. I told him all of this in the order it happened, without editorializing the way I describe a flaw in a piece of wood. Here is what I found. Here is where I found it. Here is what it suggests. Lyall listened the way he listens, which is completely and without any expression that tells you what he is making of what you are saying. His coffee went cold in his hand. He never lets his coffee go cold. That was the second thing that told me something. When I finished, the kitchen was quiet long enough that I could hear the refrigerator cycling on. A truck went by on the street outside. Lyall set his mug down and looked at the table between us for a moment. Then he said, "Do you want to know, or do you want to hope?" When a man who has seen everything goes quiet after you finish talking, what does that silence mean? It means he already has a frame for what you have described. It means the shape of your story fits a shape he already knows. I told him I had stopped being able to afford hope about 3 Thursdays ago. Lyall nodded, not in the way of a man who has just received new information, in the way of a man who has just had something confirmed. He looked at the table between us for another moment, and I watched him do whatever it is he does when he is calculating the order of things. I have seen that look across 40 years, and I have never been able to read what is happening behind it. Only that something is. He said, "Give me a few days." I said I didn't have many to give. He said he understood that. Then he reached for his phone and dialed without saying a name. Outside, a dog barked once and went quiet. I watched his face and understood that whatever he was about to find out, he had already decided I needed to know it. I came back to the shop because Lyall had asked me to wait, and waiting in an empty house felt like something I could not afford that morning. He had said, "Give me a day or two," in the unhurried way of a man who has already decided what he is going to do and is simply stating the timeline. I had driven home the long way south along the waterfront, past the fish market and the tour carriages and the joggers who treat Easter week like a training camp, and by the time I parked on Meeting Street, I had not made a single conscious decision about the route. My hands had brought me here. That is not a figure of speech. After 45 years, the truck knows this address the way a tool knows the grip it was made for. I unlocked the side door and did not turn on the overhead lights. The bench lamp was enough. I stood for a moment inside the threshold and breathed the room in, not describing it to myself. Just taking it in the way you take in something you are afraid of losing before you have fully admitted the fear. Then I went to work on the rocking chair spindle, because the spindle was ready, and the chair was waiting, and the woman on Rutledge Avenue had not asked me to rush, but was nonetheless an old woman with a broken chair, and that mattered. I want to tell you something I have not told anyone, including Lyall. In the spring of 1982, 2 years after I opened the shop, Ruth sat down at the kitchen table with the accounts and did not get up for 4 hours. I was at the bench. I could hear the sound of papers moving, and occasionally the scratch of her pen, and once around the second hour, a long silence that made me look up. She was staring at the ceiling with her hands flat on the table, thinking something through. I did not ask. She would tell me when she was ready, and she was never not ready at exactly the right time. That evening, she said, "Walter, the work you make here has a reach you are not using." I said something about the local market, about the historic district, the restoration projects, the word of mouth that had been steady and was growing. She nodded and said nothing further. But I watched her across the months, and then the years begin to build something alongside what I was building quietly, without announcement. The way you lay a secondary structure into a foundation before the walls go up. A distributor here, a correspondence there, a registration I signed without reading closely, because I trusted her signature on the cover page the way I trust a measurement she has already taken. I did not ask questions because the work in the shop was good, and the accounts were solid, and Ruth's judgment had never once given me a reason to inspect it. By 1990, pieces from this shop were moving through channels I had only half understood. I knew there were international inquiries. I knew she handled them. I knew the name Briggs Woodcraft Export had appeared on documents she filed, and I had signed where she indicated. And then I had gone back to the bench because that was where I was most useful, and she understood that. We did not discuss it in full. Not once in 38 years of marriage did we sit down and go through the whole shape of what she had built alongside my work. I have asked myself why in the years since she left, and the answer I keep returning to is that she did not need my understanding to build it. She needed my trust. And I had given her that so completely and for so long that the question of understanding had simply never come up. There is a particular kind of love that does not require narration. It runs under the surface of a life the way water runs under good farmland, invisible structuring, everything present in every yield, without ever appearing in any single row. That was what Ruth did for 45 years. She did not build beside me. She built beneath me so that everything I made had ground under it that I never once had to think about. I did not know the full valuation. I did not know the 47 countries. I did not know the legal address structure or the trust instrument or the secondary holding arrangement she had registered 18 months before she died. I knew only that the shop was still standing, that the work was still good, and that the accounts were always sound. I had never needed to know more than that. Until now. The spindle was ready by noon. I set it on the tray beside the rocking chair and ran my thumb along the taper one final time. Clean end to end, no interruption in the grain. I covered the chair with its cloth and sat on my stool and thought about Ruth sitting at the kitchen table in 1982 with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes on the ceiling, working something through that I could not yet see the shape of. She had been thinking about this morning. Not this specific morning. She could not have named the date, or the restaurant, or the man at the head of the table. But she had been thinking about the shape of this morning, the moment when someone would look at the shop and see only a building, and try to take it, and find out that the building was not what they thought they were taking. She had been thinking about that morning since 1982, and she had spent the following 25 years making certain it would go a specific way when it arrived. I had done nothing to deserve that. I had simply been the craftsman. She had been everything else. My phone did not ring that afternoon. Lyall was still working. Outside, the street went through its mid-morning rhythms, a delivery truck, the bell of the church 2 blocks over, marking the half hour. The particular rise and fall of a city going about its business on a Thursday in early April. I did not move from the stool for a long time. I sat with what I now half knew and waited for Lyall to call and make it whole. My son held sandpaper the way some children hold a small animal, carefully like it might feel what he was doing to it. I was standing at the east window with the rocking chair spindle in my hand, turning it slowly to check the taper, when the memory came back the way shop memories do not, announced, not invited. Just present, the smell of fresh cedar will do that. So will the particular weight of a piece of wood that still needs an hour of work before it is ready. Everett was 10 years old, and he was standing at this same bench, and he had been standing there for the better part of 40 minutes. He was building a small box. Nothing complicated, 4 sides a bottom, a fitted lid with a brass latch. I had shown him the latch twice. The third time I stepped back and let him find it himself. He aligned it, tested it, opened and closed it 4 or 5 times. Then he stopped. I could see from where I stood, pretending to sand a cabinet door, that the latch was sitting 1 millimeter too high on the left side. A small error. The kind that most people would not notice and fewer would care about. Everett noticed. He stood there looking at it for a long time, and then I saw his shoulders move in the way shoulders move when a person is crying and trying not to be seen doing it. How do you tell a 10-year-old that the reason you do not step in is because you trust him more than he trusts himself? Yet. I did not step in. I kept sanding. I listened to him take the latch off, set the screws in a line on the bench, and start again. By the time he got it right, another 20 minutes had passed, and the afternoon light had shifted, and he had not asked me for help once. He closed the lid, tested it, opened it again, set it down, walked to the sink and washed his hands the way I had taught him, both sides between the fingers dry thoroughly. Then he came and stood beside me and said nothing, and I said nothing, and we sanded together until supper. That boy, that precise, stubborn, quietly serious boy. I set the spindle down on the bench and stood with my hands flat on the wood surface, feeling the grain under my palms, the way you feel a pulse, not looking for anything specific, just checking that everything is still there. 5 years ago, the first time Everett brought me to the Harllo estate, I drove my truck. Every other vehicle in the circular drive had a European badge on the hood. I noticed that the way I notice things, not as a judgment, just as information. The gravel was the expensive kind, small and pale and raked. The kind that is meant to be heard underfoot. Nadine Harllo, Harlan's wife, 61 years old. The woman who manages the public face of everything the Harllo name touches. Who moves through a room the way a person moves when they have decided in advance which parts of it are worth looking at. She took me on a tour while Everett spoke with Harlan across the room. She was gracious in the way that cost nothing. She showed me the garden, the library, a sitting room with tall windows facing the harbor. And then she paused in the hallway before a side table. It was a Chippendale-style piece. Ball and claw feet, carved cabriole legs, a scalloped apron. She told me it had been in Harlan's family since 1887. She said they'd had it appraised. It was a reproduction, a good one. I knew in 3 seconds. I said nothing. I kept my hands in my pockets. I said something about the proportions being beautiful, which was true. The craftsman who built it had known what he was doing, even if what he was doing was making a copy. Nadine smiled and moved on to the next room, and I followed, and the tour continued. And at dinner, Harlan turned away from me mid-sentence to address someone across the table. And the food was rich, and the wine was expensive, and Everett sat beside Claire and laughed at things that were not quite funny. Some knowledge sits in your hands the way a flaw sits in wood, invisible, until the light hits it at exactly the right angle. I drove home that night with Everett in the passenger seat. The city lights thinned as we crossed the bridge, and then thickened again on the other side. Everett leaned his head back and looked at the ceiling of the truck and said it had been a good evening. I said yes. The heater made a small ticking sound near the left vent, the one I had been meaning to fix. The road was empty. Charleston at 11 o'clock on a Sunday has a particular quiet to it, not absence, just the sound of a city breathing slowly. I kept my eyes on the road and said nothing about the table. I had already decided by the time we reached the highway that I would never correct them about anything, not until it mattered. And now it was starting to matter. Lyall called at 6:40 in the morning, which told me everything before he said a word. A man who has found nothing calls at a reasonable hour. A man who has found something small calls mid-morning after coffee after he has decided how to frame it. Lyall called at 6:40, which meant he had not slept, which meant what he had found was neither small nor frameable. I was already dressed. I told him I would be there in 40 minutes, and I did not ask him what it was on the phone, because some things should not be said over a phone line before you can see a person's face when they say them. The drive north was the same road as before, but it felt different in the early light. The harbor was flat and gray, and the palmetto trees along the boulevard were still in the windless morning. I stopped at the gas station on Rivers Avenue and bought 2 coffees in paper cups and thought about nothing specific, which is what I do when I know I am about to need all of my thinking in one place. Lyall's kitchen table had 3 stacks of paper on it when I arrived. He did not say good morning. He moved the sugar bowl to the counter to make room and gestured at the chair across from him, and I sat down and he began. The first stack was the guardianship filing. A physician's signature on the preliminary capacity assessment, a doctor whose practice had received a significant consulting contract from a real estate development entity connected to Harllo. Harllo's portfolio 14 months before the assessment was written. Lyall had pulled the business registration, the contract dates, the payment records. He laid them in sequence without comment. The second stack was a room reservation, the Harllo Senior Care Facility on James Island. A private room reserved in a specific name deposit, paid intake forms partially completed. A room already reserved 6 weeks ago in my name. I picked up the intake form and read the name at the top twice. Then I set it down and picked up my coffee cup and held it with both hands and looked at the window above the sink, where the morning light was coming in at a low angle and catching the dust on the glass. The coffee was too hot to drink, but I held it anyway. It gave my hands something to do. The third stack was different from the first 2. It was not about me. It was about 3 other people, 3 other elderly property owners in Charleston County, all with significant holdings, all with no surviving spouse, all of whom had transferred title to properties within 18 months of a guardianship filing that bore the signature of the same physician. Lyall had found their names through probate filings and property records. He had cross-referenced the legal representatives on each case. The same firm appeared in all 3. Let me tell you what it feels like to read a document that was written before you knew you were in danger. It does not feel like fear. Fear requires uncertainty, and there is nothing uncertain about a document with your name printed at the top of a form for a room you did not request in a facility you have never visited. What it feels like is geometry, angles resolving, lines that look separate suddenly meeting at a point you can now see clearly. I was the 4th. That was what the 3 stacks of paper said taken together, not the first, not a mistake. The 4th in a documented sequence, which meant the sequence had been refined, which meant whoever designed it had learned from the first 3 attempts what worked and what needed adjustment. Lyall let me sit with that for a while. He refilled his own cup and stood at the counter and did not say anything, which is one of the things I have always respected about him. He understands that some information needs room to settle before you can talk about it usefully. Then he placed a 4th document on the table, a single page, a consent form authorizing a preliminary guardianship assessment and designating a legal liaison to act on behalf of the family during proceedings. Everett's signature was at the bottom. I read it once. I read it again. The signature was his. I know my son's handwriting the way I know the grain of mahogany by the particular way it moves and where it slows. I set the page down flat on the table and put both hands on top of it, palms down, the way you hold a piece of wood that is trying to tell you something. I was not angry. I want to be clear about that. Anger is hot and it passes. What I felt was cold and it was not going anywhere. After a long silence, I asked Lyall whether Everett had understood what he was signing. Lyall said he could not tell me that. The signature was real, the understanding behind it that he could not determine from a document. I nodded. I did not pursue it. There would be time for that question later, and it needed to be asked in person in a room where I could read my son's face the way I had read the grain of wood my whole life. I asked Lyall if the financial reporter at the Post and Courier still owed him a favor. He said yes. I told him I needed him present on Easter Sunday at the Palmetto Room on East Bay Street, and I told him what time. Lyall picked up a pen and wrote the address on the back of an envelope without asking me why. He already knew. That is the thing about a man who has spent 40 years finding things he understands when finding them is only the first half of the work. I drove back to the shop and opened the locked drawer in the base of the workbench, the one I have not opened in 8 years. The wallet was on the passenger seat where I always put it. When I drive at night, 20 years of leather, worn to the exact shape of my hand. I had taken it from the drawer without ceremony. There was no moment of hesitation, no hand resting on the handle before I pulled. I had simply unlocked the drawer, lifted the wallet out, held it for 3 seconds to confirm its weight, and put it in my jacket pocket for the drive home. Then I had changed my mind and set it on the passenger seat instead, because I wanted it where I could see it. Not from sentiment, from the same reason you keep a tool on the bench surface rather than the shelf when you are going to need it before morning. I drove south through the city in the particular quiet of a Wednesday night that has nothing left to prove. The streets were not empty. There were restaurant lights on East Bay, a group of people outside a bar on King Street, the slow crawl of a rideshare on the one-way near the market. But the traffic had thinned to the kind that moves without friction, each car finding its line and holding it. I drove at the speed the road offered and did not think about where I was going, because I already knew where I was going, and the knowing was enough. The wallet sat on the passenger seat in the light from the dashboard. Black leather, almost charcoal now, from decades of handling the fold soft and giving at the crease. She had called it shapeless once early in our marriage, and I had told her it had simply taken the shape it needed to take. She had looked at it for a moment and then at me and said that was either profound or an excuse, and she had not yet decided which. I had kept the wallet. Inside it, behind my driver's license, was the card. I had carried it for 8 years without using it. I want to be precise about that because there is a difference between carrying something and keeping it. Keeping implies storage, something set aside, something you are not ready for yet. Carrying implies intention, even if the intention has not yet found its occasion. I had carried the card every day since the week after the funeral, in the wallet on my hip, through every trip to the lumber yard, and every client consultation, and every Thursday evening call, and every Sunday dinner at the Harllo estate, where Harlan had turned away from me mid-sentence. It had been there through all of it. I had simply been waiting for the morning it was meant for. Ruth had told me I would know. She had not been dramatic about it. She had sat across from me at the kitchen table in the last autumn of her life, 2 weeks after she had told the doctor what she had decided about treatment. And she had pushed the wallet toward me across the table. I had set it down to eat something I rarely did, and she had said, "Keep the card in there. You will know when." Then she had picked up her fork and returned to her dinner. And we had talked about something else, and I had put the card in the wallet that evening without asking her to explain further, because she would have explained if explanation were necessary, and it was not. 8 years, I had known when. The drive home takes 22 minutes at that hour. I know this not from timing it, but from the number of lights on the route and the rhythm of the signals at night, which run on a longer cycle and let the intersections breathe. I stopped at 4 of them. At the third on Rutledge, I sat in the idle and looked at the wallet on the seat and thought about Lyall's kitchen table that morning, the 3 stacks of paper, the 4th page with Everett's signature, the specific flatness in Lyall's voice when he confirmed what the document said. I thought about the room Harlan had already reserved, south-facing window, garden view, my name on the intake form. I thought he does not know what is in that wallet. The light changed. I drove. At home, I went in through the kitchen and did not turn on the main light. The stove lamp was enough. I set the wallet on the counter beside the kettle, not in my pocket, not in the drawer on the counter where I would see it first thing, and drank a glass of water standing at the sink. The yard outside the window was dark, except for the ambient glow of the neighbor's porch light catching the edge of the azalea bed. The first buds were there, pale and tight, not yet committed to opening. Another week, maybe less. I did not review the plan. I did not go over Lyall's documents or think through the sequence of Sunday morning or rehearse the words I would or would not say at the table. The preparation was complete. Going over it again would not make it more complete. It would only be the mind doing what the mind does when the hands have already finished the work, and the mind has not yet accepted that its part is done. I carried the wallet to the bedroom and set it on the nightstand beside the lamp. The lamp Ruth had chosen on King Street 39 years ago, the brass base and the cream shade still giving its same warm light to the same room. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment and looked at the wallet there in the lamplight and thought about nothing at all, which was the first time in 3 weeks that nothing had felt like peace rather than avoidance. I took off my shoes and set them parallel at the foot of the bed. I turned off the lamp. I did not lie awake. I was awake before the bells. I lay there in the dark and let Easter come to me rather than going to meet it. The ceiling was the same ceiling it has always been. The room had the particular stillness of a house before 5:30 when the birds have not yet decided and the street has not yet started and even the light seems to be waiting for permission. I lay still for a few minutes and listened to Charleston waking up by degrees, a truck somewhere on Rutledge, the first birds at the back fence, the slow brightening of the gap between the curtains. Then I got up and dressed. I wore the shoes she had bought me for Everett's wedding, black leather sole, the kind of shoe made to last rather than to impress. She had left them in the closet in a box with a note tucked inside the lid, written in her particular hand, very upright, very clear, for the days that require the right foundation. I had worn them twice since the wedding. Today made 3. I want you to understand something about those shoes. She picked them out without telling me. She paid for them herself. She did not ask my size because she already knew it, the way she knew most things about me that I had never thought to say aloud. I put them on that morning and laced them slowly, sitting on the edge of the bed in the early light, and I thought about that note and what it had cost her to write it, not sentimentally, but practically. She was a precise woman. She did not write things she did not mean. In the kitchen, I made coffee and sat at the table in the low morning light, the way I do on mornings that matter. I talked to her the way I have talked to her since she left quietly without ceremony, the way you speak to someone you are certain is listening, even when you cannot verify it. I told her what the day was. I told her the legal team had confirmed everything the day before. I told her about Lyall, about the journalist, about the room we were all walking into this morning, and I told her that the documents were in order and that the plan was sound. I said it the way you say something to a person whose judgment you trust more than your own, not seeking permission, but keeping her informed. St. Michael's rang the quarter hour at 7:15. The sound came through the kitchen windows, clean and unhurried, the way bells sound on a morning with no wind. From somewhere on the block, the smell of a neighbor's Easter ham drifted through the screen, something with brown sugar and clove. A smell that belongs to this particular Sunday the way the bells do. I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, and picked up my wallet from the counter where I had placed it the night before. The drive to Lyall's was 20 minutes. I did not stop. He came to the door before I had finished parking, which meant he had been watching for me, which meant he had not slept much. We shook hands on the doorstep, a long one, the kind where you hold a beat past the point where you would normally let go. Some things do not need to be said, and some handshakes contain the sentence you would have said if you had been the kind of men who said it. How many times in a life do you get 30 seconds to decide if you are the right person for what is about to happen? He asked if I was ready. I told him I had been ready since Wednesday night. He nodded once and we separated, and I drove south into the city. The Palmetto Room sits on East Bay Street, 3 blocks from the waterfront, in a building that was a counting house before it was a restaurant, with original plaster crown molding and floors that were laid in the 1840s and have not been replaced because the owners understand what they have. I have eaten there twice in my life, and both times I was the guest of someone who wanted me to feel the weight of being treated. I pulled into the lot behind the building at 10:15 and turned off the engine and sat. 30 seconds. That is all I ever give myself before a piece of work begins 30 seconds to confirm that the preparation was right, that the tool fits the task, that my hands are steady. Not doubt, not rehearsal. Just a moment of standing at the threshold before you step through. I straightened my jacket. I checked that the wallet was in my inside pocket where it always rides. I got out of the truck. The room was already full. That was the first thing wrong. I pushed through the door and stopped for half a second, not from hesitation, but from reading. Tables arranged in a specific configuration. Faces turning. A level of preparation that told me immediately this gathering had been designed around an occasion, a purpose. A formality that no one had described to me as anything other than an Easter family lunch. I looked at the room the way I look at a piece of furniture I have been asked to assess, starting from the structure working outward, noting where the weight was placed and where it wasn't. I was the only person here who did not know what today was supposed to be. I have walked into a lot of rooms in my life. I have never walked into one that had been built around my absence. I stood just past the entrance and let the door close behind me and did not move toward the nearest table. I gave myself 10 seconds. In 10 seconds, you can read a room the way you read a piece of wood before you commit the blade, not looking for what you want to find, but for what is actually there. The Palmetto Room had 40-foot ceilings, an original plaster crown molding, and floors that had been laid in the 1840s. And had not been replaced because whoever owned the building understood what time does to good material. Under other circumstances, I would have been glad to stand in it. Under these, I was cataloging it. 30 guests approximately arranged at round tables of 6. White tablecloths pressed to a standard that told me the linen had been done off-site. Crystal stemware, not the restaurant's usual inventory this was brought in. Flowers at each table, cream and pale gold, the kind ordered in advance from a florist who was told a color story before the occasion was described. Everything in this room had been decided weeks ago. Nothing about it was casual. A room tells you everything if you know how to look at it, the same way a piece of wood tells you where it wants to split before you ever touch the blade to it. Near the head table, Harlan working the room with the restless momentum of a man who has already won and is now enjoying the ceremony of it. Stopping at each cluster of guests with his hand on someone's shoulder, his laugh arriving a half second before anything funny was said. Nadine beside him, composed and directional, guiding the morning, the way a project manager guides a timeline, smiling but tracking. And at the far end of the head table, Preston Harllo, 31 years old, Harlan's son, seated with the relaxed authority of a man who has been told he is inheriting something, and has already started behaving as though the transfer is complete. 3 lawyers in dark suits near the south wall, standing rather than seated, the kind of stillness that comes from waiting for a cue rather than from ease. 2 women with tablets near the east, exit one of them, scrolling through something she already seemed to know. And near the windows, separated from both the family clusters and the legal team, a man in his 40s with a reporter's notebook and a pen that had not stopped moving since I walked in. He was not a guest. Guests do not write things down at Easter dinner. 3 lawyers at Easter dinner in matching suits. Claire appeared at my elbow before I had crossed 5 feet into the room. Claire Harllo Briggs, moving with the warm efficiency of someone who had been watching the door. She touched my arm and smiled and said, "Walter, we saved you a seat right here. We are so glad you could make it." She said, glad the way a person reads a word from a card, the tone correct, but the weight slightly off, like a reproduction with good proportions. I thanked her and followed her to the table. My seat was at the near end of a round table, 3 chairs from the center, positioned with a clear sightline to the head table and no clear sightline to the south wall where the lawyers were standing. Someone had thought about that. I sat down and set my phone on the tablecloth face down, and looked at the breadbasket in the center of the table, which was the kind of breadbasket that arrives before anyone has ordered anything, because the menu has already been decided for you. Everett was 2 seats to my left. I had not seen him enter. He was already seated when I arrived, one hand flat on the tablecloth, the other in his lap, his posture carrying the careful uprightness of a man managing something he is keeping below the surface. I looked at him. He looked at me. 2 seconds. That is all it took. What does it mean when your son cannot hold your eyes for more than 2 seconds? not because he is guilty, but because he is ashamed of something he still has not found a way to undo. He said Dad. Low, not quite a whisper. I said Everett in the same register, and I did not look away first. He held my eyes for 2 seconds long enough for me to read what was behind them, which was not guilt exactly, but the specific heaviness of a man who has agreed to something he can no longer describe as a good idea. Then he straightened in his chair and reached for his water glass and did not drink from it. What I saw was not the look of a man who had chosen this morning freely. It was the look of a man who had agreed to something when the agreeing seemed simpler than the alternative, and who was now sitting in a room where the consequences of that agreement were arranged on white tablecloths around him, and who had not yet found the moment or the words to change direction. I picked up my water glass and drank. The water was cold and tasted of nothing, the way very filtered water does, clean to the point of absence. I set the glass down. I straightened my jacket. I placed my phone on the table and found Lyall's name in my contacts and rested my thumb over it without pressing. At the head table, Harlan reached into his jacket pocket and produced a crystal-handled dinner knife. He tapped it once against his water glass. The sound was clean and carrying the kind that reaches every corner of a room without effort. The conversation at every table stopped one cluster at a time until the room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when everyone already knows what is coming. The small talk lasted 11 minutes. I know because I counted the way you count anything you are waiting to be over. Property values on the Upper Peninsula, the spring market tightening, waterfront revival, someone said, and 3 people nodded at once with the synchronized enthusiasm of people who have been told in advance what to be enthusiastic about. I ate the bread from the basket in front of me and said nothing, and kept my right hand near my jacket pocket, and watched Harlan move through the ambient conversation the way a conductor moves before. The downbeat not directing yet, but already in charge of the tempo. He had a way of listening that was not listening. His eyes were present, his chin was inclined toward whoever was speaking, but the attention behind his eyes had already moved on to the next thing. The food arrived between the small talk and the announcement, a first course of something cold with herbs plated the way food is plated when the presentation is part of the message. I tasted it without tasting it. The silver was heavy, and the linen smelled of professional laundering, that particular flat mineral cleanness that has no domestic equivalent. I noted these things the way I note the details of a room I am assessing, not because they mattered in themselves, but because together they told a story about how much this morning had cost to prepare and how long it had been in preparation. Harlan rose when the first course plates were cleared. He did not tap his glass again. He simply stood, and the room oriented toward him with the practiced ease of people who expected it. He straightened his jacket, looked across the table with an expression of considered warmth, and began to speak about Charleston. He spoke about the harbor and the history and the responsibility of families who had built something in this city, the obligation, he said, to steward rather than simply hold. He spoke well. I will grant him that. He had the cadence of a man who had given this speech in his own head enough times to have worn the rough edges off it. Then Preston Harlan's son, at the head table, with the forward lean of a man who knows his cue is coming, stood and distributed the architectural renderings. The paper was heavy. The design was professional. I looked at the waterfront block first, then traced the street grid east toward Meeting Street, found the corner I have stood on since 1980, and looked at what was there. A blank space. 45 years, and they drew a blank space. No label, no notation, not even a line marking the building's footprint. Just the white of the paper, where my shop should have been surrounded by the detailed draftsmanship of everything Harlan intended to put in its place. The guests at the nearest table were passing their copy between them and nodding. No one looked at me. The rendering had not been designed for my reaction. It had been designed to make my reaction irrelevant, to present a version of the future so fully realized that the question of my consent had already been settled in the design. I set my copy face down beside my bread plate and kept my right hand on the table and listened to Harlan continue. There is a specific sound to the word family when it is being used as a tool. It sounds like warmth. It sounds like consideration and care, and the reasonable arrangement of things that need to be arranged. It comes with pauses in the right places and a slight softening of the voice when the key words arrive, comfort, security, legacy, love. Harlan used all of them. He used them in a sequence so practiced that each one arrived before the last had fully landed, and the cumulative effect was the sound of generosity, which I suspect was precisely the effect he had rehearsed. He named Everett. He said it with the measured warmth of a man conferring an honor. He explained that Everett had agreed to step in as guardian because that he said is what families do for the people they love. He said Walter has built something remarkable, and now we have the privilege of ensuring he can enjoy it in peace. He said, "We only want what is best for you, Walter." And he looked directly at me when he said it, and the room was quiet, and 30 pairs of eyes moved to my face to read my response. Everett's knuckles were white on the tablecloth. He had agreed to have his name on that paper. He had not agreed to have it read aloud in front of me. I looked at Everett for 1 second. His jaw was set, and his right hand had closed around the edge of the tablecloth so tightly the linen had lost its press. His shoulders had the particular uprightness of a man holding himself very still, because stillness was the only thing left available to him. He did not move when Harlan said his name. Not a flinch, not a nod, nothing. I looked back at Harlan. He was raising his glass. Around the room, 30 hands reached for their stemware, and 30 glasses came up, catching the light from the chandeliers, and the gesture moved through the space like a tide unanimous, coordinated the conclusion of a performance that had been running since before I sat down. 28 glasses went up. Mine stayed on the table. So did Everett's. Harlan held his glass at the level of his chest and let the toast complete itself. The sound of crystal in the air, the rustle of guests settling back into their chairs, the small collective exhalation of a room that has performed an expected thing. He was smiling. It was a good smile, well practiced, the kind a man develops over decades of rooms like this one. And then his eyes moved for just a fraction of a second, no longer than it takes to cross a name off a list, to Everett's glass still flat on the tablecloth. Something crossed Harlan's face that was not part of the smile. Then it was gone, and he was speaking again. He described the room at Harllo Senior Care the way a person describes something they have seen and found satisfactory. South-facing window, he said, garden view, a sitting area. He said it had been ready for 3 weeks, which is the kind of detail a man includes when he wants the other person to understand that the decision has already been made in every meaningful sense, and what is left is only the formality of agreement. He said the word comfortable 4 times in 2 minutes. Each time he said it, it meant something slightly different, and none of the meanings were about comfort. 28 glasses. The sound of them rising was the loudest thing in the room. I kept my hand inside my jacket pocket and my eyes on Harlan, and my face arranged in the expression I use when I am reading a piece of wood. For the first time, neutral, unhurried, collecting information before committing to anything. Nadine was watching me from across the table with the careful attentiveness of a woman waiting for a reaction she has been told to expect. Preston was leaning slightly forward in his chair, in the way of a man who believes the interesting part is about to begin. At the windows, the man with the notebook had not looked up since Harlan began the 3rd movement of his announcement. His pen had not stopped. Harlan set his glass down with a small definitive sound and gave a slight nod to the table where the lawyers were standing. The 3 of them moved as one, the synchronized efficiency of men who had discussed the order of operations in advance and had no reason to improvise. Briefcase latches opened in sequence, a sound like 3 small calibrations. Papers came out. The lawyers carried them to the main table and began to lay them in sequence across the white linen, with the careful spacing of people who understand that presentation is part of persuasion. A lawyer who has done something 40 times does not leave room in his voice for the 41st time to go differently. There is a particular quality to that voice, not arrogance exactly, but the removal of contingency. The lead lawyer began explaining the timeline for property transfer authorization, the sequence of signatures, the schedule for the guardianship assessment hearing. He spoke at the pace of someone reading to a person who will need to be walked through each step, which told me what he thought of me before he had finished his first sentence. He said, "Mr. Briggs, your signature is required on pages 1, 4, and 7. And he pushed the first document across the tablecloth with 2 fingers, and the confidence of a man who has never watched anyone refuse to pick up a pen. I looked at the document. I did not touch it. I looked at Everett. He had not moved since the glasses went up. His water glass was still full beside his right hand. His eyes were fixed on the space between the glass and the edge of the table, not looking at anything exactly, but resting there. The way a person's eyes rest on a middle distance when the thing they are not looking at is directly in front of them. His jaw was set. His shoulders had the quality of a man holding himself very still, because stillness is the only thing available to him in the present moment. I had seen that look on my son's face twice in 40 years. I knew exactly what it meant. It meant he already knew he was wrong, and he was waiting for someone to show him the way back. The first time was when he was 11 years old, and he had broken the handle off a cabinet I had spent 3 weeks building, and he had tried to hide it. And when I found it, he stood in the shop with exactly this expression, not defiant, not performing regret, just waiting. The second time was when he was 23 and had made a decision about money that he could not undo and came to tell me about it, and stood in the kitchen doorway with his hands in his pockets and this same fixed waiting stillness. Both times, the thing he needed from me was not a verdict. It was a direction. The lead lawyer was still speaking. The document was still on the table in front of me, page 1 face up. The signature line visible at the bottom with a small adhesive arrow pointing to it, the way adhesive arrows always point insistently, as though the pen is already in your hand. My hand was already in my jacket pocket. Now, the lawyer's voice filled the space where an answer should have been. He had the cadence of a man who has rehearsed a silence into every pause room left for agreement, none left for anything else. I let him fill it. My phone was already in my palm under the table screen facing my thigh, and I typed one word without looking down. 4 letters. I have never sent anything that weighed more. I slid the phone into my jacket pocket. I picked up my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip, the way you drink when you are not thirsty. But your hands need something credible to do. The water was cold. It tasted of nothing, which was correct. I set the glass down. I began to count, not aloud, not by clock. The way I count sanding strokes on a surface that will not forgive an uneven hand, by feel by the full weight of each second passing through the body rather than the mind. 1. The way you press on a first pass consistent establishing the direction. 2. The lead lawyer turned a page. 3. Harlan nodded at something the lawyer said, the slow, authoritative nod of a man confirming what he already knew. 4. Nadine had her hands folded on the table in front of her. 5. Near the window, the man with the notebook had turned to a fresh page. 45 seconds is nothing. 45 seconds is also exactly how long it takes for the right thing to become permanent. I did not look at Everett. I did not look at Harlan. I watched the room the way you watch a piece of wood you have just set an edge to, not for what you have done yet, but for what you are about to do. The lawyers were still speaking. The guests at the nearest table had resumed a murmured conversation about something that had nothing to do with the documents being laid across the linen in front of me. The flowers in the centerpiece were cream and pale gold, and they smelled faintly of something I could not name, precisely the way expensive cut flowers always smell, not like a garden, but like the idea of one. 15. The second lawyer was placing a document near the foot of the table. 20. The lead lawyer paused to confirm a page number with his colleague. 25. I could hear the faint scratch of the notebook pen from across the room. 30. Harlan said something low to Preston. I could not hear the words. 35. Everett had not moved. 40, 41, 42. Sitting completely still while a room moves in the wrong direction, knowing the message that will turn, it has already been sent, is not patience. It is the interval between the stroke and the sound. It feels like standing at a bench with a plane in your hand and the first stroke already made and the wood already committed to the shape you chose for it. The room does not know yet. The room is still the room it was 35 seconds ago. But the work has started. The work cannot be undone. 43, 44, 45. I folded my hands on the table in front of me. I did not reach for the pen. I did not look at the document on my left. I set my hands flat on the tablecloth, one over the other, the way you set tools down when a job is finished, and what comes next is not your work to do. If you are still here with me, please drop a comment to let me know you are still following this journey. Tell me, do you see Walter's choice in this moment as justice or mercy? I read every single one. And a quick note, what follows includes some creative elements shaped for the narrative which may not align entirely with a literal record, if you prefer not to continue under those terms. You may choose to stop the video here. The door opened. It opened from the outside with the weight of a door that has not been expected to open a sound distinct from the ambient movement of the room. A sound that carries across conversation and silverware and the shuffle of documents because it is the wrong sound in the wrong moment. Every head at the table turned. The lead lawyer stopped speaking mid-clause. The door opened. Every head turned. Harlan's glass was still in his hand. Lyall Cotton walked in. 74 years old, Ruth's older brother, a man who had spent 40 years finding things that other people believed were hidden. Carrying a worn brown leather case in his right hand with the ease of a man who has carried it 1,000 times. He was not in a hurry. He moved through the entrance of the Palmetto Room's private dining with the complete deliberateness of a man who has been waiting a long time to walk through a specific door and intends to arrive, at exactly his own pace. He looked at the room. He looked at me. I looked back at him. Harlan was the first to speak. His voice had lost one register of warmth. Not all of it, not yet. But the upper layer, the warmth he had arranged for the occasion, had thinned. He said, "Can I help you?" Lyall set his leather case on the nearest empty chair and looked at Harlan with the particular patience of a man who has already read every document in the room. Harlan asked again. "Who are you?" Lyall told him. The room didn't know what to do with Lyall. That was always one of his best qualities. Harlan said his name. His own name delivered as an introduction and a boundary at once, and then said, this was a private family event. Lyall let the sentence finish. He had the patience of a man who has spent 40 years waiting for other people to complete their objections before he speaks. And he waited through Harlan's full sentence with his hands on the leather case and his eyes level and unhurried. Then he said, Lyall Cotton, retired investigator, 30 years. I'm here because Walter asked me to be. 2 sentences, flat unembellished the way you state a fact that doesn't require decoration because the decoration would only weaken it. Harlan opened his mouth and then did not speak, which was the first time in 4 hours I had watched him fail to find a follow-up. Lyall moved to the table. He did not move to the head of the room. He did not address the assembled guests or position himself for an audience. He moved to the windows to the empty chair beside the man with the notebook, and he set his leather case on the table there with the ease of someone who had already chosen this spot before he arrived, close enough to the notebook man that when the first document came out of the case, it landed in the natural field of view of anyone sitting or standing within 3 feet. Do you know what a room full of people looks like when it realizes simultaneously that it has been watching the wrong man? It looks like a small recalibration. Not dramatic, not the way it happens in stories where everyone gasps or stands. It is quieter than that. It is 30 people adjusting the angle of their attention by a few degrees and not quite being able to explain why. I watched it move through the room from table to table as Lyall opened the case and began to lay the first document on the white tablecloth with both hands face up, positioned so it could be read from either side. The lawyers across the room had stopped their conversation. One of them, the younger of the 2 women with tablets, had moved 2 steps closer without appearing to decide to do so. The lead lawyer was still holding his pen, but it was no longer moving. Lyall worked from left to right on the table surface the way you work a piece of wood, establishing the direction first, then committing. He placed the first document, the guardianship filing the physician's signature, the Harllo financial consulting contract, with its payment records and dates. He said it without commentary. He placed the second, the restricted client fund transfers the intermediary entities the resort development account records. He aligned it beside the first, with the same deliberate spacing. Each piece of paper landed with a sound that was barely a sound, the soft contact of paper on linen, but in the silence of the room, it was specific and distinct. Marcus Cole put down his notebook. He picked up his phone. He did not stop recording for the rest of the morning. I had not planned for that. I had planned for Cole to be present and to witness, and Lyall had positioned himself accordingly. But the moment Cole shifted from notebook to phone was a decision Cole made on his own, and I felt it register in the room the way a structural change registers in a building, not loudly, but completely. Whatever this morning had been before, it was now something that would be described later in print to people who were not in this room. Lyall placed the third document layer, 3 separate files, each one a property transfer, each one preceded by a guardianship, filing each one bearing the signature of the same physician. He set them in a row and aligned them and stepped back 1/2 step, the way a craftsman steps back to look at something he has just placed to confirm the level is true. I watched Harlan look at those 3 property records, and I watched the moment he understood he was not the only person in this city who had been keeping count. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way a crack moves through wood, slowly at first, a hairline traveling the grain without announcement, and then the moment the whole piece shifts, and the separation is complete. His jaw was set. His glass was still in his hand. His eyes moved from the first file to the second to the third, and then stopped, and the stopping was the thing. His eyes stopped, not blinking, not shifting, simply stopped at the third file to arrive. Nadine had her hands in her lap. Preston was leaning back in his chair, the studied ease gone, both feet flat on the floor now. Everett had not moved, but the quality of his stillness had changed. It was no longer the stillness of a man holding something back. It was the stillness of a man waiting for something to release him. Lyall reached into the case one more time. He removed a single page. He placed it on the table slowly, face up at the far end of the row, and he looked at Harlan. "There are 2 more pages, Mr. Harllo." The room was silent in the particular way of a room that has stopped performing. Harlan looked at the page. Then, for the first time since I had sat down at his carefully arranged table, he looked at me. Silence has a texture when it means something. This one felt like the moment before a plank splits everything holding nothing safe. The wallet was on the table where I had set it. I opened it the way I have opened it 10,000 times, by feel the leather soft and giving at the fold, and I took the card from behind my driver's license. It was the same weight it had always been, that specific heaviness that is not dramatic, but is distinct, the kind of weight that tells your fingers something before your eyes confirm it. Matte black. No logo. Briggs Woodcraft export in raised silver letters across the face. I held it for 1 second, and then I did not hold it anymore because there was a waiter standing 2 feet to my left, and the card had been waiting 8 years for this particular errand. I stood up first. That was the thing that changed the room before I said anything. I want you to understand something about the first words a man chooses after a long silence. They are never accidental. A man who has been quiet through an entire morning of announcements and documents and 30 raised glasses has thought about what his first sentence will be. He has decided what register it will arrive, and what it will ask of the room, what it will assume about who is listening. I had decided mine a long time ago. I looked at the waiter, 27 attentive, the kind of careful professional who had been trained to anticipate rather than react, and I said, quietly and directly, "I'd like to settle the bill for the table, please." Harlan laughed. It was a good laugh, timed, pitched correctly, carrying just enough warmth to hold the room for the 2 seconds it needed to. He said something about sawdust and credit limits. Preston smiled. One of the cousins at the far table made a sound that was meant to be amusement. The joke moved through the room, the way water moves through a space with a leak, finding every small opening covering the floor before anyone thought to check the walls. I did not respond. I did not sit back down. I took the card from my wallet and handed it to the waiter and said nothing else. The waiter's face drained. He said, "Excuse me." He walked toward the back like the floor had changed gradient. There is a specific way a man walks when he has just been handed something that alters his understanding of who is in the room. It is not a run. It is not a hurry exactly. It is a walk with a new center of gravity, the weight of what he is carrying shifting the whole rhythm of the movement forward toward whoever needs to know what he now knows. I watched him go, and I kept standing, and I said nothing further. Harlan made another comment. I did not catch all of it. Something about accountants, something meant to be wry, and the laugh it earned was thinner and less certain than the first. The silence between his sentences was growing the way a gap grows in a joint when the wood begins to dry, imperceptible at first, then undeniable. Preston had stopped smiling. Nadine's hands were still in her lap. Lyall was near the windows beside Marcus Cole, who had not lowered his phone. I counted 2 minutes the same way I had counted 45 seconds, not by clock. By the quality of the air and the small adjustments people make when they are waiting for something they cannot name. One of the lawyers had moved to the side of the room, near the documents. The second woman with the tablet had stopped scrolling and was watching the door to the back corridor. Then the door opened. The waiter returned first, and he was no longer leading. Behind him came a man in a charcoal suit, Mr. Calloway, 56 years old, general manager of the Palmetto Room. A man whose composure was not a personality trait, but a professional construction built over decades of managing a room that hosted the kind of events where composure was the difference between a record and an incident. He moved the way a load-bearing wall moves, not fast, not slow, but with the particular authority of something that has been holding things up for a long time and does not require anyone's acknowledgement to continue doing so. He was off balance. Not visibly to the room, the suit was straight. The walk was even, the hands were at his sides, but I could see it in the 2-second recalibration his eyes made when they found me at the far end of the table, a small internal adjustment. A man matching what he was expecting against what he was looking at and finding that the two things were the same person. He came across the room and stopped directly in front of me. The smell of the room had changed in the past 2 minutes. The cut flowers were still there, cream and pale gold. But underneath them, I could now smell the faint metallic current that large rooms carry when the temperature of the social dynamic inside them has shifted. Something sharp and faintly mineral, the smell of a room that has changed its mind about itself. Mr. Calloway stopped in front of me and said my name the way you say a name when you have been trained to treat it with a specific kind of care. Harlan had gone very still at the head of his table. Calloway shook my hand first. Before he said a single word to the room, he shook my hand, and that told me everything Ruth had put in motion was still in motion. It was a firm handshake, brief, the kind that carries information rather than warmth. His eyes confirmed the same thing his hand did, that my name was not new to him, that the card had not surprised him, that the Palmetto Room and the name on that card had a history that predated this morning by more than either of us needed to explain in front of 30 people. He released my hand and turned to face the room, and in that turn I understood something I had not fully articulated to myself. Until that moment, I had not chosen this building at random. I had chosen it because the building already knew who I was. Ruth had arranged that too in her unhurried way years before anyone needed it. Calloway addressed the room without preamble. He did not look at Harlan first. He looked at the table generally, the way you address a space rather than a person, when the information belongs to everyone present equally. He said the name, Briggs Woodcraft Export. He said it had operated from the Meeting Street address since 1982. He said it held licenses and registrations in 47 countries. 47 countries, $320 million. The Meeting Street address on every single one. He said the valuation, $320 million current independent, and he said it in the flat register of a man whose job is to confirm, not editorialize. I watched it move through the room. It moved differently through different people. The dinner guests closest to the Harllo family absorbed it with the particular stillness of people recalibrating a social landscape they thought they understood. The lead lawyer set his pen on the table and picked up one of his own documents. The second lawyer was already reading something. Nadine's face had found a new arrangement that was not the arrangement it had been wearing all morning. Harlan heard $320 million, and his face went quiet. Not pale, not stricken, quiet. The performed confidence drained out of it slowly at first, then completely the floor gone out from under it. And what was underneath was a face I had not seen on him before, the face of a man who has built something that he now understands is smaller than the thing he was trying to take. Calloway finished. He stated the legal consequence: the address is not separable from the corporation. Any forced transfer or demolition renders every registered instrument legally void. And then he stepped back, One, half-step the way a person steps back when they have said the thing and are now simply present for whatever follows. Let me tell you what one sentence sounds like when it has been earning itself for 45 years. I looked at Harlan. He looked at me. The room was quiet in the specific way of a room that has stopped pretending to be something other than what it is. I said, "You wanted my shop. It turns out you can't afford what comes with it." I did not raise my voice. I did not elaborate. I had carried that sentence from Lyall's kitchen table to this one, and it had done everything it needed to do in the time it took to say it. Harlan's mouth opened, then it closed. He did not speak, and his silence was the most accurate thing he had contributed to the morning. I turned to Marcus Cole, 42 years old, financial journalist at the Post and Courier, the man with the notebook who had put the notebook down and the phone up, and had not looked away from the table since Lyall laid the first document, and I set the originals in front of him. I said, "These are yours." He looked at them and then at me and gave one nod, the small, compressed acknowledgement of a man who understands the weight of what he has just been handed and is already composing the first paragraph in his head. I turned to the lead lawyer. I said in the same register I had used to ask for the bill that the Harllo financial leases on 3 properties would expire in 90 days and would not be renewed. He looked at the document in front of him, and then at his colleague, and then back at the document. There was nothing in his briefcase that addressed this, because nothing in his briefcase had been prepared for this morning to go in any direction other than the one Harlan had rehearsed. What do you say to the lawyers when their briefcases are full of documents that no longer mean what they were designed to mean? You say nothing, you let them read. I let them read. I looked for Everett. He was where he had been all morning, 2 seats to my left, hands on the table, the stillness in his body different now from how it had been an hour ago. The stillness of controlled waiting had gone. What was there instead was something quieter and more exposed. The particular quality of a person who has been holding a version of themselves in place for a long time and has just been released from the effort of holding it. He was looking at the table in front of him, not at me, not at Harlan, at the table. The look I gave my son was not an ending. It was the same look you give a piece of wood that has warped, not ruined, just changed by what it went through, and still worth the work of bringing it back. I held it long enough for him to feel it and look up. And when his eyes found mine, I let him read whatever was there. I did not arrange my face. I did not perform forgiveness, and I did not perform accusation. I looked at him the way I have looked at him since before he had words for me, which is with the specific, unedited recognition of a father who has known this person at every age and has no version of him that is final. His jaw was still set, but his eyes had changed. They had gone from the fixed inward stare of a man who has run out of road to something more present, more uncertain in the way that uncertainty is the beginning of a turn rather than the end of one. I turned away first, not to end it to give him room. Claire was at the far end of the table. She was watching me the way she always watched me at these dinners, with the careful attention of a woman taking an assessment she would not share aloud. I did not stop. I picked up my jacket from the back of my chair, nodded once to Lyall, and walked toward the door. The harbor light came through the buildings in the way it does in April low, and specific the kind that makes everything look like it has just been decided. The exterior door of the Palmetto Room opens onto East Bay Street, and the light hits you from the direction of the water 2 blocks east. And on Easter Sunday at mid-morning, it is the particular gold white of a city that has dressed itself for the occasion. I pushed through the door and stopped on the sidewalk and breathed, all the way in, all the way out. Ruth used to say that was the whole practice, learning to breathe like you meant it. I had not meant it in weeks. I meant it now. The smell of the harbor came on a small wind salt and low tide, and the faint diesel of a working waterfront. The smell Charleston has carried since before I arrived in it, and will carry long after I am not here to notice. I stood in it for a moment and did not think about anything in particular, which was the first time in 3 weeks that not thinking had felt like a choice rather than a failure. I walked to my truck. The door handle was warm from the April sun, a specific dry warmth that is different from summer heat, the warmth of a surface that has been sitting in mild light for a few hours and stored it without urgency. I got in. I sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel and looked at East Bay Street, and then I drove. I drove back to the shop without rehearsing anything. For the first time in weeks, the silence in the truck was just silence. Somewhere behind me, Everett was still sitting at that table, and I already knew he would not be sitting there much longer. The shop was exactly as I left it this morning. That was the thing about it, it was always exactly as I left it. The world outside could become unrecognizable, and this room would still smell like mahogany and linseed and 45 years of the same work. I had parked the truck in the usual spot and walked around to the side door the way I always do, and when I stepped inside and turned on the workbench lamp, the rocking chair was still on the bench where I had left it before dawn, the spindle cured and ready. The cabinet in the corner still had the loose handle I had been meaning to fix. The broom was leaning against the wall beside the door. The coffee burner on the shelf in the corner was cold and had been cold all day. And the particular absence of that smell, the particular emptiness of a cold burner in a room where coffee used to be made at 6 in the morning, was its own kind of presence. I sat down on my stool and did not pick up a tool. I sat there for about 10 minutes, doing nothing, which is harder than it sounds. Let me tell you something about sitting in a room you have worked in for 45 years with nothing in your hands. It is the hardest kind of sitting there is. The hands want to find something. They have been trained over a lifetime to reach to sand, to measure, to correct, and asking them to simply rest on your knees in a room full of things that need doing requires an act of will that does not get easier with practice. I let them rest anyway. I looked at the rocking chair on the bench and the lamp throwing its yellow light across the grain of the mahogany and the sawdust on the floor that I had not swept this morning because I had left before first light and dress shoes, and I let the room be exactly what it was. After a while, I got up and swept the floor. I swept from the back wall toward the door, the way I always do, working the dust into a line, and then gathering it up, and the sound of the broom on the concrete floor was the sound this room has always made. The particular dry whisper of bristles on a surface worn smooth by decades of exactly this motion. The smell of fresh sawdust comes up when you sweep a clean, bright smell that is different from the settled smell of a shop at rest. And I breathed it in and thought about nothing specific and kept sweeping. Missing someone the way I missed her was not a wave. It was a watermark, the kind left by something that passed through long ago, still visible if you held the page to the light. I thought about the coffee burner. She had brought a cup every morning, without asking not, because she was performing attentiveness, but because she had noticed early in the first year that I never stopped to make my own, and she had simply decided to resolve that. That was how she was. She paid attention, and then she acted on what she noticed without making a ceremony of it. The burner was still on the shelf where she had put it in 1987, which was a long time to keep a coffee burner that you never used. But the thought of moving it had never occurred to me as something that needed to happen. I fixed the cabinet handle. The screw had worked loose over 2 weeks of the handle being opened, and closed the wood, compressing slightly around the thread. 4 minutes a screwdriver and a small piece of wooden toothpick packed into the hole to give the thread something new to bite. I tested it twice. It held. It had been waiting 2 weeks to hold, and now it did, and that was all there was to it. Some things are just that simple, and the simplicity of them is a gift on a day when most things have not been simple at all. I sat back down. The shop was quiet in the way it goes quiet after 8 o'clock on a Sunday, when the street outside has settled and the neighbors have gone in and the city has pulled back to some internal register. I could hear the faint traffic on the avenue a block over, and somewhere farther off, the sound of a bell that might have been street. Michael's, or might have been something else, and the small ticking of the workbench lamp as the metal expanded in the warmth of its own light. The rocking chair sat on the bench in the lamplight. The spindle was cured and fitted, and the chair was finished and ready, and I had not noticed until that moment that finishing it this week in the middle of everything had been the most continuous thing I had done, the one task that had run alongside all of it, without being interrupted by any of it. 8 o'clock, gravel. I knew before I knew. The sound came from outside the side door, footsteps on the gravel path, a specific weight and rhythm and pace that I recognize the way you recognize a wood species by the sound it makes under a plane, before you look and before you decide. I did not move from my stool. I did not call out. I set my hands on my knees and waited. I heard the footsteps stop just outside the door. I did not move from my stool. I have known those footsteps since he was small enough that they made no sound at all, and now I waited to hear what they would say when the door opened. 3 knocks. He has knocked that way since he was 7 twos, quick ones slow, like a question and its answer. I said come in and the door opened inward the way it always has. With the slight lift of the handle he has known since boyhood, because the frame settled years ago and the latch needs that small accommodation. He stepped into the lamplight, still dressed from the morning jacket, gone somewhere between the palmetto room and Hirtai, loosened and pulled to one side. The dishevelment of a man who has been sitting somewhere quiet for several hours deciding whether to move. He looked older than 40 in that light. Not old, just weighted the way a person looks when they have been carrying something they have not yet set down. He set it down before he spoke. He crossed to the workbench and placed a small wooden box on the surface beside the rocking chair. I recognized it before I had fully looked at it. The proportions, the brass latch on the right side, the particular color the wood had taken on over 32 years of being handled and stored and kept. I had made that box for him when he was 10 years old in this room at this bench. He had kept it for 32 years. Tonight he had brought it back without a word. I want you to understand what it means when a grown man sets down the first thing his father ever made for him before he says a single word. That is not an opening statement. That is a whole argument made in silence. He looked at the box for a moment and then looked at me. His hands were at his sides. He said, I don't know where to start. I said start wherever it's true. He did. He talked for a long time, which was not something he had done with me in years. Not since before the Harllos, before the Thursdays stopped. Before the distance between us became something with dimensions, he and I both knew better than to measure aloud. He talked the way people talk when they have rehearsed something many times, and then decided at the last moment to say it differently, more plainly, without the prepared shape of it. His voice was even. He did not cry. He did not ask me for reactions. He told me the sequence. The first time Harlan presented the guardianship plan, Everett said no. He said it clearly, and it ended the conversation. The second time, 3 months later, Harlan had reframed it not as control, but as planning, as family stewardship, as what responsible people do when they love someone. Everett said no again. The third time, he brought Preston and a lawyer, and Everett said no a third time and told Claire about it afterward. 3 times he said no. The 4th time, Harlan told him I was already losing things. Everett said yes. 3 times he said no. The 4th time, Harlan told him I was losing my mind. Everett said yes. He said this the way you say the thing you have been ashamed of, longest flatly, without softening, because softening it would be the final dishonesty in a sequence that had already cost too much. He said I believed him. He said that was the worst thing I have ever done. He said I'm not making excuses. I'm just telling you the sequence. Then he stopped. The shop was quiet in the way it goes quiet when 2 people have decided not to fill the silence yet. The lamp threw its yellow light across the workbench, and the wooden box, and the rocking chair, and the wall behind, and somewhere outside, a car moved along Meeting Street and was gone. I sat with it for a moment, not because I needed to decide anything I had already decided, somewhere between the parking lot and the sidewalk and the drive back, but because the sequence deserved to be heard completely before anything else happened in the room. I got up from my stool and went to the corner where the coffee pot had been sitting since morning. There was maybe a cup left in it, cold and dark, and hours past its best. I poured it into the mug I keep on the shelf above the burner, the plain white one chipped on the rim, the one that has been there since before Everett could see over the workbench, and I carried it across the shop and held it out to him. Cold coffee handed to someone you love is not a small thing. It is the same gesture as a fire. It says you are here, and I am still feeding you, and we are not done yet. Everett looked at the mug. Then he took it with both hands the way you take something from a person when you understand the full weight of what they are handing you. I said, it's the last of the pot. It's cold. He said nothing. He held the mug. My son took the coffee with both hands. I sat back down on my stool. Neither of us spoke. What I thought was, he is in this room. That was enough for right now, and not enough, and we both knew it. I got up from my stool and walked to the third bench, the one with the crack. I had been meaning to tell him about that crack for a long time. Everett had the coffee mug in both hands, and he watched me cross the shop without speaking. The third workbench is the oldest one set against the north wall, built the same year I opened the shop and never replaced, because it still does what a bench is supposed to do. The crack is in the right rear leg, a diagonal split, maybe 6 inches, starting 3 inches from the floor. I crouched down beside it and ran my finger along the length of it, the way I have done probably 100 times in 11 years. I told him I did it with a hammer. I was rushing a mortise job, and the hammer slipped and I caught the leg instead of the workpiece, and I heard the crack and I knew immediately what I had done. I could have repaired it. I chose not to. I left it there where I could see it every morning, because your mother said, wrong things have to be named, not fixed tonight. Just named or they move into the work, and you don't notice them until they have already done the damage. Everett came and crouched beside me. He looked at the crack for a moment without speaking. Then he looked at me. Showing a man his father's mistake is not a lesson. It is an invitation into the same room. I stood up and went back to the workbench where the wooden box was sitting. I picked it up the way I pick up any piece of work I am being asked to read, not looking for what is wrong, but for what it actually is. I turned it in the lamplight and ran my thumb along the joints and pressed the latch and opened and closed the lids twice. The joinery was even. Not perfect the way a machine makes perfect, but true, the way a careful hand makes true, each joint bearing its weight evenly. The lid seating without resistance because the hinge was hung square and had stayed square across 3 decades of opening and closing. What does it mean to read a piece of work honestly not for what went wrong, but for what it actually is? It means you are looking at the person who made it, not the record of their errors. I told him I could see 40 minutes of work in the latch fitting, the way the screw holes were started slowly, the way the plate sat flush on both sides without a shim. I told him I had watched him make that latch when he was 10 years old, and I had not said anything then because the lesson was between him and the wood. 32 years, and it had not moved. That was not luck. That was someone who cared about the thing they were making more than they cared about being done with it. We talked for another hour. I do not need to describe every word of it here. Some conversations are private in the way a joint is private internal load-bearing, not visible from the outside, but responsible for holding the whole shape together. He talked and I talked, and at some point, the shop stopped feeling like a place where a reckoning was happening and started feeling again like a place where 2 people worked. At around 10 o'clock, Everett put the mug down on the bench and stood up and straightened his shirt. He asked quietly if he could come in on Saturdays again, like before. He said yes, 1 syllable, the way you confirm a measurement you have already taken and trust. I said yes, 1 word, nothing added to it. Some answers do not require explanation. He put his hand on the door frame, not quite inside, not quite outside the particular position of a person, finishing something at a threshold, and he said, "I'm sorry, Dad." He said that's the truest thing I have. I watched him walk to his truck. The gravel made its familiar sound under his feet, and then the door opened and closed, and the engine turned and the tail lights came on, red in the dark. And I watched them until they reached the street and turned south and were gone. 8 months ago, I had stood in this same doorway and watched the same taillights and felt the first clear shape of something wrong. Tonight I stood in the same place and felt a different thing entirely. Not the wound opening, but the particular quality of a wound that has been cleaned and is now simply present, beginning the slow work of closing on its own terms. I went back inside. The wooden box was on the workbench where he had left it. I looked at it for a moment. He had left it here, which I understood to mean he was leaving it where it belonged, not returning it as a surrender, but placing it in its original location as a way of saying, this is still what I am, and this is still where I come from. I turned off the workbench lamp. I locked the shop and walked home through the spring air. Tomorrow, the rocking chair. Saturday, my son. The paper arrived at 6:15. I read Marcus Cole's byline before I read the headline. Then I read the headline. Then I made a second cup of coffee and read the whole thing twice. The rocking chair had gone to the woman on Trad Street the morning before, delivered at 8 o'clock, the way I deliver everything on time, without ceremony. The piece wrapped in moving blankets in the bed of the truck. She had been on the wait list for 14 months, and when she saw it, she ran her hand along the back rail and did not say anything for a moment, and that was the right response. The right response to a piece of furniture that has taken 14 months to reach you is silence. I had driven home through the Thursday morning streets thinking about nothing in particular, which is how I knew the week had settled. When a week settles, the mind goes quiet in the way a workshop goes quiet after the last tool is put down, not empty, just finished. The story was on the front page of the Metro section. Cole had used everything. Every routing entity in the fund, transfer records, every physician payment, every guardianship filing date, all 4 cases laid out in sequence with the precision of a journalist who understands that the job is to present facts in the order that makes their meaning. Unavoidable. Harlan's name was in the headline. The corporate entities were named. The 3 prior property owners were not identified by full name, but their situations were described with enough specificity that anyone in Charleston who had been paying attention would understand what they had been through. I thought about each of those 3 people as I read. I do not know their names. I know what was done to them, and I know it was done methodically with legal instruments by people who had practiced the methodology. That knowledge sits differently after you have read it in a newspaper than it did when Lyall first put the documents on the kitchen table. Let me tell you what it looks like when consequences arrive the way they are supposed to. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the correct order, each one landing where it belongs. It looks like a Thursday morning at a kitchen table with a second cup of coffee and a newspaper that has already done its work before you have finished reading it. The justice in that is not loud. It does not announce itself. It arrives the way good joinery holds not with a sound, but with the absence of one. I read the article once through, and then went back to the parts that would matter, later the legal filings cited. The corporate documentation Cole had clearly obtained from a source with intimate familiarity with the internal structure of Harllo Financial. The 2-sentence quote from a former client that contained the particular quiet devastation of someone who has been told by a journalist that what happened to them happened to other people too. That 2-sentence quote was the most important thing on the page. It was more important than Harlan's name in the headline. It named a pattern. I folded the paper when I was done and put it in the drawer in the kitchen where I keep documents that are finished. The legal sequence ran from April through July. The guardianship filing was withdrawn. Within the week, I received a letter from Harlan's attorney proposing terms which I set on the counter and did not respond to, because there was nothing to negotiate. The work was done. What Lyall had assembled, what Cole had published, and what the 3 corporate filings on record in 3 separate jurisdictions confirmed was not a matter that benefited from further conversation with Harllo's representatives. A handwritten letter arrived from Nadine a few weeks later, 3 pages in her careful script, clearly composed over more than one sitting, clearly meant, and clearly insufficient in the way that 3 pages is always insufficient for certain things. I read it once and placed it in a different drawer, the one I do not return to. It deserved to be read. It did not deserve a response that I did not have the language for, and I have never been a man who produces language he does not have. Nadine wrote 3 pages. She meant every word. I put them in a drawer I don't open. A message from Preston arrived through a social platform in May, brief, poorly worded. The syntax of a man who had not decided whether he was apologizing or justifying, and disappeared into a folder I did not check. In July, the 3 Harllo Financial leases on the historic buildings on East Bay and King Street expired and were not renewed. The buildings are registered landmarks on the Historic Preservation Registry, and the new tenants, a preservation architecture firm, an independent bookshop, and a marine heritage nonprofit were announced in a short piece on the business page of the same paper that had run Cole's story. The announcement carried the particular civic satisfaction Charleston reserves for things it considers correctly resolved. I read that piece standing at the kitchen counter before my coffee was finished and felt the shape of it close. The Saturday mornings came back the way a routine comes back after a long interruption, not announced, not ceremonial, just present again, the way light comes back after a door opens. Everett arrived before 8 at the first Saturday, and we did not discuss what we were doing. He found an apron on the hook where it had always been, and I handed him a piece of cherry wood that needed to be squared, and the shop made the sound it makes when 2 people are working in it, which is different from the sound of 1 person. The second Saturday, he brought coffee, 2 cups mine, black, no explanation needed. The third, he arrived before I did and was already at the bench when I unlocked the door, and I stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at him before I came in. And I thought of 100 previous years and did not say anything about it, because there was nothing to say that the moment had not already said better. In the last week of April, without looking up from the cherrywood, he was fitting Everett mentioned that he had left Harllo Financial. I said all right. That was the whole exchange. The shop held the words for a moment, the way a good room holds sound briefly cleanly, and then returned to its ordinary silence. A Saturday later, the end of April, the cherrywood now fitted and waiting for finish, he was sanding the first face of a side table I had given him to practice on, and he said, still without looking up, that he was talking to someone, a professional. He said it the way you mention a fact that does not require context, if you are telling it to the right person in the right room. I said good. He nodded once. We both went back to what we were doing. Everett went back to sanding. I went back to the spindle I was fitting. Neither of us said anything else. Outside the harbor was doing what it always does, indifferent and continuous. I thought this is enough. And then I thought, there is one more thing. The one more thing had waited long enough. I set down my coffee mug on the kitchen table, still half full, still warm, walked through the hall, and turned the brass knob on the back office door. The room smelled of cedar and old paper, the way a room smells when it has been holding itself still for a long time. I did not turn on the overhead light. The window above the filing cabinet gave me enough. Morning sun came in at a low angle, and the dust in the air moved slowly in it, the way dust moves when no one has been inside for weeks. I stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the room, the way you look at something you have been circling for a long time without committing to entering. The top drawer of Ruth's filing cabinet was the one I had always left alone. Ruth Briggs, my wife of 31 years, a woman who kept her counsel the way a good craftsman keeps a hand plane, clean precise, and never left out in the rain, had organized that drawer herself, and told me once that I would know when to open it. She said it the way she said most things that mattered, without emphasis, without repetition, as though it were a fact she was confident I would file correctly and retrieve when the time came. She did not explain what she meant by when. She rarely explained. She believed that the person who needed to understand a thing would understand it when the moment arrived and not a minute sooner. And she had been right about that every single time in 31 years. I understood now. The drawer opened smoothly. Ruth had waxed the runner's beeswax from the smell of it, a small detail she would have considered obvious. The kind of consideration that is invisible when everything works and only noticed in its absence. Inside, standing upright in a craft paper folder, secured with a length of cotton twine, were 2 documents. No envelope, no letter. Just the instruments themselves, the trust document and the transfer record clean properly witnessed, filed 18 months before she died. The notary stamp was from a firm on Queen Street that I had passed 100 times without registering. Ruth had labeled the folder in her formal hand, the one she used for things that needed to last, Briggs Woodcraft Export Structure. Do not disturb. I carried the folder to the kitchen, poured the cold coffee down the sink, and brewed a fresh pot. I sat down and read both documents in full. It took 40 minutes. When I finished, I set them on the table and looked at the garden through the window, the roses coming in along the back fence late April, the color not yet settled. Ruth had planted those roses because the variety bloomed twice, spring and September. She had a habit of choosing things that gave back more than once. Here's what the documents told me, without a single word of explanation. She had spent more than a decade building a secondary holding structure around the shop, quiet, unglamorous. Entirely legal, that placed the building, the land, and the operating licenses in an arrangement that would have taken Harllo's lawyers another decade to fully map. She had not told me because she did not want me to think about it. She wanted me to build. She would do what she did well, and together the whole thing would hold. It had held. I carried all 4 pages back to the back office, returned them to the craft paper folder, retied the cotton twine with the same knot she had used, and placed the folder in the drawer. I closed it. The waxed runners made no sound. I went to the shop. Everett was already there, sanding a cherry panel at the second bench. He looked up when I came through, and I gave him a nod and put on my apron. We worked for an hour without talking. The cherry wood gave off its particular sweetness when the sandpaper moved across the grain, faint almost like something left in a room after baking not quite food, but close. Not quite memory, but related to it. At some point, Everett said, without stopping his work, "You found it, didn't you?" It was not a question. "Yes," I said. He nodded and kept sanding. I picked up a finished spindle from the tray beside my bench, turned it once in my hands to check the weight in the line, and set it back down. The grain ran clean from end to end. Ruth had always said that was the only thing worth aiming for, a line that holds from one end to the other without a single interruption. I had thought she meant the wood. I understood now she had meant everything. I had thought the drawer at home was everything. The legal instruments, the structure, the proof of what she had built. I had carried those 4 pages back to the filing cabinet and retied the cotton twine and considered the matter complete. That was the week before. I was wrong. The catch was small and perfectly made, the kind of joinery that takes longer to hide than to build, which means she wanted it found, just not immediately. She wanted it found by hands that had been working long enough to recognize what they were touching. I pressed it with my thumb, the way you press something you have been circling for a while without admitting it, and the drawer slid open with the particular resistance of a thing built to last and rarely touched. Shallow, deliberate, fitted into the back rail of the table with the same unhurried care she brought to every joint she ever cut. I had stripped this table back to its original surface over the last 2 weeks, removed 40 years of finish layer by layer, each pass of the cabinet scraper, bringing up something closer to what the wood had been before we put anything on top of it until the surface came through clean and pale and new-looking, the way wood looks when you return it to what it always was underneath all that time. And she had built the catch into the rail, knowing that stripping the table was the one act that would bring my hands to that exact place at that exact pressure, because she knew how I work. She knew I would strip it from the center outward. She knew where my hands would arrive last. She had written the discovery into the restoration itself, the same way she wrote most things, without announcing it, embedded in the process, waiting to be found by the right sequence of actions. Inside the drawer was a single envelope yellowed at the edges in the way that paper yellows when it has been kept in a dry place for a long time. The handwriting on the front was in the script I would know anywhere in any light without being told whose it was. The words read, "For when you need it most." Not for when you are ready, for when you need it most. Those are different sentences. Ready is a state you prepare for. Need is a state that finds you. I held that distinction for a moment before I held the envelope. Because she had chosen those words the way she chose everything with precision, that looked like simplicity, until you looked at it again. Let me tell you what it is to hold a letter from someone who knew you better than you knew yourself, and to read it in the room where you both did your best work. The envelope was light. It had been waiting a long time to be light in my hands. I set it on the workbench surface and looked at it for a moment, in the way you look at something. You know, you only get to open once, the kind of moment that contracts slightly around itself, the room going a degree quieter, and then I opened it carefully the way she would have wanted along the fold, with the small pocket knife I have kept on my right hip since 1978. The letter was 2 pages written front and back on the stationery she used for everything that mattered to her. Cream paper, no heading. Margins observed with the same consistency she brought to every measurement she ever made. She began without preamble the way she always did when she had something real to say. She wrote that the first international inquiry for the shop had come in the autumn of 1987, a furniture dealer in Edinburgh who had seen a photograph in a trade publication and written to ask if the maker accepted commissions from abroad. I remembered that letter. I had set it aside on the bench the way you set aside something that does not seem urgent and then do not return to. She had answered it. She had answered it, and every letter that followed it, and she had done so without telling me. Not out of secrecy, but out of the same practicality that governed everything she did. She answered it because it needed answering, and I was standing at a bench with a chisel in my hand, and she could see that I was in the middle of something, and she did not see the reason to interrupt. She wrote that she understood from that first reply, and from the correspondence that followed, that what I was making had a value that extended beyond the county, beyond the state, beyond the coast, and that she had spent the years after that autumn building a structure around it that I would not need to think about unless something tried to take it from me. She wrote about the black card. She wrote, "I wanted you to carry it every day. Some things you need to know are in your pocket before you know you need them." She explained the structure of Briggs Woodcraft Export in her plain undecorated syntax, the corporation it's registered holding, its purpose one sentence of fact, followed by one sentence of what the fact was for. Then she moved past it because she had not written the letter to explain a corporation. That was not what required 2 pages. She had written it to say what the shop was and what it had always been in language that she had apparently been composing for a long time, and finally wrote down 14 months before she died. She wrote, "The shop is not what we made. The shop is proof of how we made it. Those are different things." She signed it, Ruth, not your Ruth, not always yours. Just Ruth the way she introduced herself to people she trusted to know who she was, without needing the qualifiers to confirm it. I folded the letter along its original creases, returned it to the envelope, and held the envelope with both hands on my knees for a long time. I was not reading it again. I was simply holding it the way you hold something that has completed itself, not finished, not closed, but arrived at the place it was always going. The shop was quiet in the particular way. It is quiet on a morning when nothing is running. Morning light came across the second bench and lit the dust in the air oak cherry and the faint trace of linseed oil from the table's surface 2 days before. A finch landed on the window ledge outside, moved once along the sill, with the unhurried attention of something that has found a warm surface, and was gone. I could taste the coffee I had finished an hour ago, still faintly present at the back of my throat, the particular bitterness of a cup, drunk while thinking about something else entirely. Then running footsteps on the gravel outside, light and fast, the footsteps of someone who has not yet learned to arrive anywhere without urgency. Which is not a flaw at 4 years old, but a fact. The fact of someone for whom every arrival is still an event. The shop door opened inward the way it always has, and my grandson came through it ahead of his father, with his arms slightly out for balance and his eyes going immediately to the stripped table at the center of the room. Everett followed, closed the door quietly behind them both, and took his place at the third bench without being asked the one with the visible crack in the front rail. The one we have left unrepaired because some things that have been through enough are allowed to show it. No one said anything about the letter. Some things do not need a door open for them twice. I pulled Ruth's stool alongside the table for Everett and set it there without comment. Then I stood beside my grandson, who was already pressing his palm flat against the stripped surface with the instinctive seriousness of someone who does not yet know the name of what he is learning, but is learning it anyway. I placed my hand over his. "Feel it first," I said. "You move with it, not against it. The wood will tell you where it wants to go." He was quiet in the way 4-year-olds are quiet when they are paying complete attention. Not the performed quiet of a child who has been asked to be still, but the real kind. The kind that comes from something in the room, having caught hold of something in them. His hand was warm under mine. The grain of the table ran from the far end toward us, left to right. The same grain Ruth and I had followed together 45 years ago in the back of a smaller shop on a narrower street, on a morning that looked something like this one before we knew what we were building. Everett watched from the third bench and said nothing. I kept my hand over his. Outside October was doing what October does along the harbor, the light lower the air, with that first real weight in it, the kind that reminds you the year has turned and is not turning back. Inside the shop smelled like everything we ever built here. It always will. I have thought about this family story more times than I can count since that Easter Sunday. And if I am honest with myself, the hardest part was never what Harlan did. The hardest part was watching my son choose the wrong room for the wrong reasons, and understanding that I had played a role in that too by staying quiet for too long, by assuming that love was enough without conversation. So here is what I would tell you, from everything this family betrayal taught me: do not wait for the moment of reckoning to say the things that matter. I built in silence for 45 years and called it patience. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it was just avoidance dressed in a craftsman's apron. The lesson I carry from this family story is not about money, not about the card, not about the room full of people who finally understood what they were looking at. The lesson is simpler than any of that. What you build with honesty in your work, in your relationships, in the quiet years when no one is watching, does not disappear. It waits. And when the moment comes, it speaks for itself. I believe God placed those years of silence in my life for a reason I could not have named while I was living them. Not as punishment, as preparation. If this family betrayal has ever found a mirror in your own life, if you have ever sat at a table where you were the wrong ingredient in someone else's plan, I hope you held on. I hope you kept building. Thank you for walking this road with me all the way to the end. I would genuinely like to know, if you had been sitting at that table, what would you have done differently, stayed silent, or spoken sooner? Leave your answer below. I read every comment. If this family story stayed with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. A note worth mentioning, while the story draws from real human experiences and social themes, certain details have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this style of content isn't your preference, I hope you find something on the channel that fits you better.